So today I want to talk about the brain tools that you can use to work productively in agile organizations like Pivotal. I'm certainly not an expert in software methodology and that type of agility. I'll leave that to all of you. But what I want to talk about today is how you can work with your teams and peers in a way that allows you to foster that agility that you're striving for. And today what we'll be doing is really starting to ask some questions. We won't be getting to all of the answers, but we'll be figuring out what are the steps that we can take to ask the questions that will move us to more productive workplace relationships. So in June, I was at the Department of Justice, and I was instructed by my supervisor to join a conference call with a couple of different agencies. And I was sitting in on the call, but I had been involved in a lot of internal meetings, and so there were moments where it really made sense for me to jump in. And I wasn't sure because I couldn't see my supervisor's face. She was in her office while I was in mine, and she didn't respond at the time, but the meeting kept going, but I felt a little unsure of whether that was okay. And I started getting a little concerned. It made sense that I jumped in. I had experience in the area beforehand, and so I had something different to contribute. I don't know if you can see me. But I wasn't sure, and I started noticing that maybe she seemed to be a little short, kind of getting right to the point after the meeting. She seemed kind of very direct, like, okay, we're on to the next thing. We need to do this. These are the next steps. And it seemed that she wasn't quite as talkative about what was going on with me personally, and I was concerned that I had kind of crossed a boundary. I completely missed the fact that she said that these were very productive discussions and made a comment on the issue that I had spoken about. I completely missed that she moved on to ask me about the status of my next project. So what happened here was I created a story. I created a story where I had my hypothesis of maybe I crossed a boundary of authority that I shouldn't have. In the Department of Justice, there are very clear delineations of authority and bureaucracy. And after that, everything I saw was, yep, she must be a little irritated with me. And by the end, I was sure, definitely. But then, because I was aware that this was happening in me, I just asked her. And I said, I just wanted to make sure, you invited me. I wasn't sure how much I can contribute. Was that okay? And she looked up and just said, yeah, of course. That's why I invited you to the meeting. Right? All of this was in my head. All of this story I created was in my head. And we all make those stories. They look like this. We have a belief. There's all this evidence that goes against our belief, but there's one piece of evidence that confirms it. And so what do? We latch onto it. So what are your stories? What stories are you creating about who you are in this office and how your peers see you? Right now, we're going to start with a short exercise, just doing a 1-minute share with the person next to you. What is the story that you create about yourself? Whether that's you're always late to meetings, you aren't really performing in the way that you should be for the team. What is that story? Could be this week, last week, whenever it was. Share that with the person next to you. And 1 minute each. Okay. All right, so let's hear some of people's stories here. Stories look very different in different organizations. So the stories that we tell ourselves depend on the organization that we work in and how we communicate with each other. So what are some of the stories, either your story or if you think that your partner's story was interesting, encourage them to share, but don't share theirs without their consent and approval. So eager.
So this is something, can everyone hear me? Yep. So this is something that a couple of us actually had on this table, and it seems like it may be a common thread here at Pivotal. We join new teams a lot, and the question of adding value, especially when you join those new teams. And so that bias of not communicating and not being a part of every single discussion and feeling like you're not adding value, but there tends to be other ways in which you are able to add value, and people tend to bring that out. So that bias originally, when you're on, I'm just not adding value.
Yeah. What happens that you discussed when you start feeling like you're not adding value?
What happens in, so most of the time it's conversations you're not able to actually provide additional insight to some of those conversations that are happening, or if you're sitting there and you're pairing with others, you're the one that's sitting and watching someone else run through the code. But there seems to be other ways in which you do start to add value, and I think a lot of people here actually point out those areas and help kind of pull you up.
Yeah, great. What are some others?
Found, for example, that there was about a month where I was working on stories that all took like a week or more to finish. And so I developed this like attitude. I was like, am I somebody who just can never finish a story? Like, why is it that it takes me like a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks even in one case to like check in one thing? And it was like perhaps coincidental, but like it affected my attitude about myself that time.
Yeah. Yeah, so we think that we can't finish. And how did that impact your communication with your teammates then?
Well, we retroed about it, and we're like, it's like it all takes long, this particular thing. So it was curative, my teammates.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we define ourselves as kind of not being able to fully perform. We think that when the other person is running the code and we're sitting back, that it's because we're not really contributing and that maybe they're judging us for it. What's one more?
So I changed roles like 3 or 4 years ago, and I stopped writing software. And so I went from doing something that I knew I could do pretty well to something I didn't know whether I could do pretty well. And so I assumed that I'm terrible at everything else, basically. And I still kind of assume that. And even when I get positive feedback that I can do that other thing, I'm like, well, deep down, I know I'm really good at writing software. Am I actually good at doing those other things? A lot of doubt. Dun, dun, dun.
Right, so when we switch, we heard from a new team, or when we're doing a job that's actually different, we feel really out of our element and that we're not fully performing. Well, what do we see from this? We're all doing this all the time. Every moment of the day, all of you have done this at least 5 times today. Thought about what is it that I'm doing, that I'm not doing. Oh, I'm late to work. I'm just really not a responsible employee here. I'm a mess in other areas. There are ways that one event somehow becomes the story that we tell ourselves. What happens collectively is this. Imagine that you think about the 5 times you've done this just today. Everyone next to you, everyone in this room has done this 5 times today. All of you are communicating with each other, thinking about the things that you're doing and not doing, and how you're performing or not performing, and how they're judging and not judging you. And this happens. This happens in our workday, in our workflow, when we pair, when we work in teams, and when we try to run agile organizations. Why? What's happening is unconscious bias. Our brains are receiving so much information at once, and we have to develop a way to survive. We receive 11 million bits of information at every single moment, but our brains can only process 40 of those consciously. So 11 million bits of information, but 40 bits of which you are processing consciously. That means that when you're on the way to a meeting, when you're walking one step in front of the other, you're doing a lot that's there. You're not actually thinking, okay, what's happening with I'm lifting my left leg, I'm putting it forward, I'm putting it down. Okay, there's nothing on the floor, I think it's safe, I can keep going. What about next one? But you do notice if there's a banana peel. Then I'm saying, oh, okay, the other way. then I think that my brain's working. But actually, in both instances, my brain was working. I just wasn't even aware it was happening. Our brains are doing a lot of work, and we don't even realize it. What is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias is the mental shortcuts that your brain uses to deal with loads of information. Your brain is like a Facebook algorithm. It decides before anything even enters what is and isn't worth thinking about or clicking on. You can't actually look at all of the news sources, at all of your friends. You just need to have certain things that are on your radar and aren't. That is basically your brain. And what is happening is once it's gotten into your algorithm, once it's on your Facebook page, now it's news, right? Now you see it. Now you think it's real. But how did it get there? So unconscious bias compartmentalizes reality into boxes. This simplifies our mental processes, but disrupts our ability to hold complexity. So, of course, it would be pretty exhausting if every time you were going to your computer, you were thinking about where you were putting your right foot and then your left foot. You have a lot else to think about. You can kind of categorize, okay, no danger, I'm good. I'm just going to keep walking. But what's happening is that today's reality, today's work really requires that our brains operate in a much more complex world and hold complexities. It requires that we have these multiple considerations of short-term, intermediate, long-term, or how we feel, how we're confident or not confident about our performance, but how we're still pretty sure that we are right in thinking or asking this question about the code. Maybe I'm not exactly sure how to do this entire process, but that can still mean that I have a good question about what my partner's doing as I'm sitting back. So what's happening is that unconscious bias means that your brain looks like this. Your brain has all of these ideas and information, and so does your partner's. But they're not actually crossing. They're just operating in different worlds. They're having different conversations. What we want is your brain to look like this. We want to hack unconscious bias. We want to develop the brain tools to really unlock those unconscious biases so we can be communicating with each other in a way that's actually furthering our work and fostering agile teams and organizations. Unconscious biases impact what you see, hear, notice, and remember, and what you don't. Everyone remembers playing the telephone game when you were 5 years old? Never really actually got it to the end. That was the whole point of it, right? Is none of us actually hear what was said to us. This happens whether it's linguistically in the telephone game when you're 5 years old, or when you're playing a different game at work with your colleague and trying to figure out, what was that email? Why was there no exclamation point? Why was he so short? Why didn't he say hi and ask how my day was? He just looked down and kept walking. That when we miss those, when we miss the complexity of the relationship of what's happening, we miss opportunities, and we miss an ability to really develop relationships that foster our goals in our organizations. So it happens with Dilbert too. Dilbert's boss says, take your feet off the desk. And Dilbert asks, is this an example of random management, or do you think it will make our stock rise? The response, a thought bubble, it's up 0.02%. Hee, not so random after all. So these are the kind of stories. I did a public policy degree at Harvard and everything in quant and statistics. You know, they teach you these couple years of, oh, these are the concrete math tools for how you digest data. At the end, it's all about the story that you're telling. You can say anything about the sampling size, about the internal and external validity, about the methodology that they used. Anything you want, you can use to undermine an argument if you want to. Or you can also point to those same things to support it. It's about how our brain processes information, not about information as an actual objective reality. Another example of this Give me a moment to find unbiased data that supports calling you and your ideas stupid. Sounds about right? We hear these ideas from our colleague. Oh, why don't we try this new idea? And automatically, what do? I'm not so sure about that. We're already thinking, what do you feel right now when I say that? You think about your partner, your manager, maybe saying, I have a new idea. You're excited? No, not so much. We want to operate in our comfort zone because our comfort zone is where we feel competent. It's where we know what we're doing, what we're not doing. We don't have to actually ask questions and learn. But that impacts also what we hear and what we don't hear. It impacts on two levels: your perception of yourself and your perception of others. Either you're in line or very, very sad, shriveled. So unconscious bias gets in the way. It gets in the way of the way that we process information, how we hear, notice, and remember, and how we don't, how we're able to be effective managers and team players, and how we're able to operate in an agile workplace because we can hold complexity and quickly adapt and respond. Why is this? I started talking about the way you step one foot in front of the other. Well, this originally did have a purpose. Originally, we were in the Stone Age, and it was useful because you needed to know, does this smell indicate that I can eat this plant or not? Is this growl something I need to actually run from to save my life? But now, our realities are slightly different. In front of the computer screen and working with teams, suddenly that same instinct results in these kind of meetings, which nobody really thinks it's stupid. So it's a problem. It impacts retention, productivity. Gallup has done a number of studies on the way that retention is impacted by employee engagement. And these are critical to how organizations maintain the knowledge and the relationships to really get the work done. It also has a lot of huge other impacts. This is a study from October that run by Ernst & Young about the biases workers experience in the workplace. And as you can see, there are significant numbers, 25% for who experience bias based on race and ethnicity, about 24% on gender, and then other indicators of job title, education level, socioeconomic status, because they have children, sexual orientation, accent, marital status, disability, and because they're not sure. Because they're just confirming their biases that, of course, they don't actually have a good relationship with their colleague. It also can result in discrimination charges. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has claims of discrimination against it, and these are just from 2015. And statisticians have even attributed 7% of the gender wage pay gap to these biases after controlling for about 12 factors that attribute to the discrepancy, which I have in an index if anyone is more interested in that. So now what? What do we do with this? Well, to hold complexity, we need to develop the brain tools to unlock unconscious bias. How do we do that? What I would want us to discuss now is a step-by-step process that we can all start using to deconstruct those biases that we all hold and start taking away some of their power, seeing them for what they are outside of ourselves. We're going to look at that process and then try it out. The step-by-step framework is quite simple. Just 3 steps to nip it in the bud. 1, notice your judgment. Unconscious bias is unconscious. We often operate not even realizing that we're believing it. So step one is notice that it's there. How do you do that when it's unconscious, right? That seems to be against the entire definition. Notice your reactions and your feelings. When do you feel silent and not wanting to speak up? When do you say, no, it would be better if I don't think I really know what I'm doing right now. I'm not going to say anything. What's actually happening? Why are you not speaking up? On the other end of the spectrum, when are you really confident? When are you really excited and completely agree? Oh, I think that's a great idea. Let's definitely do that code. Well, when we're excited, sometimes that can mean that it's familiar to us, we feel competent in that space, so we actually don't identify the information that goes against our belief. So extreme emotions are actually data about your biases. Step one, just notice those judgments. Step two, identify the evidence supporting your conclusion. So I noticed that my judgment at the Department of Justice when I thought that my supervisor was unhappy with me having overstepped an authority boundary. After that, I asked, okay, what evidence am I basing that on? Okay, she invited me to this. She talked or spoke very short afterwards. She didn't really comment on the fact that I had spoken in the meeting. What is actually making that story? And third, plain devil's advocate. What is it that is actually happening that I'm missing, that I'm not locating? What is it that my supervisor did to say, hey, let's get right on the next project? Well, that seems to indicate she still trusts me, right? She had, in a previous comment, noted that my experience having done work on this in local communities was useful in that space. So there, she seemed to indicate that it was invited. There was all of this data that I was missing. So in the examples that we had here about when you're new to a team, you've never worked with this team before, maybe you've never worked on this type of project before, you've switched to a different operation or task within an organization. What is the judgment that I'm making? Okay, I feel pretty incompetent right now. Identifying evidence. Why do I feel incompetent? Well, I feel that way because, I haven't said anything. So I haven't been speaking. And because right now they're at the computer working away really actively, and I'm not. Okay, that happens for different reasons. What does it actually, or why am I actually thinking that means that they think I'm incompetent? What is it about that? And then plain devil's advocate. Okay, well, what are the other interpretations of what's just happened? In what ways is my partner saying, oh, don't worry, I know I've been there before too. I've done this, so we just have a deadline. Let's just do this quickly. I know that we want to learn, but maybe this just isn't the moment. Is the data that there's a deadline that indicates that action needs to be taken in a different way? So what are your biases? We're going to do a short exercise to nip your biases. So first we'll do this silently, where you'll just kind of think it through in your head, and then we'll share with each other on what we learned there. So your perception of self and perception of others. First, choose what bias gets in the way. We saw the cats before of the ways that either our biases against ourselves or against others. Choose a bias that you want to work on right now. Mostly, I think most people here think I'm blank. Or I think my partner, my teammate, thinks I'm blank. Another one is I think ex-colleague is this type of person. Because we also enact biases, right? Are we judging our colleagues? So take a minute and answer one of those two. Either, I think I'm blank type of person, or I think this colleague is this blank type of person. Now, go through the steps. What is your judgment? Everyone have their judgment? Identify the evidence supporting your conclusion. What makes you think that? You can also close your eyes to make it easier, though that's always awkward at work, so it's your call. Was it something that happened today? Was it a specific event? Is it something they said or a behavior that they enacted? If it was something they said, was it the tone of their voice, or was it the content that they actually said? Be very specific about what it was. Take 30 seconds to think about that. Now play devil's advocate. What is the evidence that that's not actually what was happening? What other interactions with that person, what other actions that you've taken, things that were said or done, indicate that maybe your story isn't actually true? 30 seconds to think about that. So who found that third step harder than the second step? Yeah? Yeah, why? Because you literally can't locate them. You literally don't even remember and notice those communications that go against what you believe. When we're operating and we have these assumptions, we actually locate information that confirms what we believe, and we're missing all of this other information that's actually there. And this is really powerful. Let's take one moment to share one thing that we learned from that exercise with the person next to us. Just 1 minute each to share with a partner. And introduce yourself if you haven't met them. All right, let's hear from a few people. What is it that you learned, or that you found that you or your partner learned, or maybe a reflection on how different what you both learned was?
So James and I both came to kind of a similar conclusion, which is this framework, it works, and it's something that you can do. But if you want it to be really effective, it's something that has to be like a continuous process, like of awareness, of mindfulness. Because if you let all these, kind of like your gridlock picture, if you let everything kind of just pile up inside, and then you try to nip it it's gonna be a harder process, maybe more painful emotionally or whatever. If you hang on to it for so long, you may also have taken actions based on those biases or conclusions, and that's actually going to physicalize your bias in the world, like against yourself. Like you're kind of you're taking your biases and you're going to externalize them and actually make them real. Whereas if you just kind of staying on top of it all the time, which takes a lot of energy, like you can kind of keep the level more smooth. And so it's like it's harder, but it's in a way you sort of have to keep staying on it.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm going to take a few more, but because it's right on that topic, one of the things that you can do to seek to counter that is identify these biases in advance. So we talked about the perception of self and the perception of others. Well, if we can really explore what our self-perception is and how we perceive others, what are kind of our triggers, then we can better prevent ourselves from getting stuck in perpetuating our own dynamics. And one way to do that is within our perception of others. Our perception of self we know pretty easily. We can think of 3 different ways that perception of others is really, we're triggered by those. One is deal breakers or pet peeves. There might be something that you just hate in your personal life, that your spouse or friend was always late. And so if someone's late at work, it really gets on your nerves. Or maybe it's making a deadline. Whatever it is, if we can identify what are those triggers, what are those deal breakers for me, because if I know what they are, they will apply irrespective of who the person is, right? Even if it's a friend in the organization or if it's a manager, if it's another colleague, we'll be able to realize, oh, they were just late. Okay, I need to make sure that I'm not, rejecting everything that they're about to say and still listening. I'm probably going to have a difficult time listening right now. The second way is confirmation of their individual behaviors. So maybe that individual was late the first time that you had a meeting together. Or maybe the first deadline was they were not really following through. Or maybe it wasn't the first impression, but it was a really important one, where it was a huge deadline, it was a huge meeting, and they were late, and you really remember that. When that happens, you will forget that for every one time they were late, there were 4 times that they were on time. For every one time they didn't follow through, there were 4 times that they did follow through. So think about, what do I expect of them before I even start working on this project with them? If you think that you can predict their behavior, that's a bias. Third, we can work with someone who maybe we don't have an individual history. We don't know what they as an individual did, and so we don't have a lot of data on which to base our expectations. But we still have expectations. Those expectations can come from our beliefs about their identity, the group to which they belong. This is something that is always a dynamic, but particularly in this year, this election cycle, where identity politics has been on the top of everyone's mind, that means that these biases, these stereotypes or prejudices, which is what they are, but no one has prejudices or stereotypes, right? Like, who has those? No. Yeah. Oh, one person is honest. I like it. We don't have those, but they operate everywhere around us, right? It's a irony. I'm the only one here that doesn't have this. How did that happen? If we can see what those are, they're more important than ever, because no longer is it something that we saw in this movie that we were socialized into. It's something that we just saw when we read the paper this morning. It's something that I saw, that you saw, that your teammates saw. And that means that it's closer to the surface in your subconscious. It's more likely to be triggered because either you may be more likely to interpret their behavior in the context of their identity, or they are more likely to interpret your reaction to them in the context of their identity, because that is a frame that is on the top of all of our minds. So these are really important, and if we can look at what those are and look at these 3, we can start to preempt that process of getting stuck, starting to enact these biases, and now we're bought in, and we have skin in the game. If we can do that at the beginning and do that work, we can stop it before it gets too deep. I want a couple more of the other reflections before we wrap up on when you spoke with your partner, what surprised you? What did you find interesting or funny that they were doing or that you did?
Well, we both sort of had a similar reflection of like, oh, maybe I'm only paying attention to the incidents that confirm my thought or assumption about a coworker, and totally ignoring all the other cases where their behavior is not that. And one thing I was thinking of is that it seems like it'd be a really helpful exercise to do before giving feedback, to be like, okay, how much of this is like actually how they're behaving and would be valuable feedback, and how much of it is just I'm missing all the other cases where this is not an issue.
Definitely. That's something that my partner Jonathan Raymond and I look at, is both on an individual level, how can we all act in ways that check our unconscious biases, and on an organizational level, how can we create a plan that really thinks about how these operate and tackle them before they're enacted. One more. No one has unconscious biases here, of course. It's the other people in the room.
Well, one thing that surprised me about what David said, when he said that he feels like sometimes he doesn't know what he's doing, it's like David has been here like the longest person that I know, and like if he doesn't know what he's doing, we're all screwed.
Exactly. If he doesn't know what he's doing and he's been here the longest, we're all screwed. That goes right back to what we said at the beginning, which is we're all doing this all the time. So we went through the step-by-step framework. We talked about what those biases are. As we know, to hold complexity, we must develop the brain tools to unlock unconscious biases. These unconscious biases, by putting information into one box or the other, you're unable to hold the complexity that you need in your relationships to be able to say, wow, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing, but so does David, so maybe I have a legitimate question still. Holding complexities and holding complex realities is the key to creating thriving and agile cultures. The good news about this is you actually didn't learn anything new today. Did you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but it only proved what I already knew. What you even heard today, what you remember, what you just spoke about with your colleague of what they remembered, what they're reflecting on, and what you actually remember that they said is not actually what they said, right? David was saying that he just switched teams. I was in this team, and then I switched to this different role, and now this is the way that I feel in this role. And what was your name? And Meredith is hearing, wow, David thinks he's incompetent? Like, this is awesome. Right? I'm just listening to confirm my biases. That's the only reason I'm here. Right? This is happening all the time, every moment. So my organization at Refound, we do this work looking at how you can use unconscious bias to really break down these dynamics to have more productive and vibrant cultures, relationships at work. We do live events, online training, and executive coaching. He has a book called Good Authority, and we really believe that it's always been something that we care about, particularly now with the context of identities making it more and more difficult to operate at work or getting more and more stuck. This is such a powerful tool. And if we can just start nipping it in the bud, it's not that hard. We can start getting some momentum and getting unstuck and fostering those agile relationships and organizations. Thank you. And I'll take some questions, but before, I'd love to ask, if you want to know about more data and graphs, because I'm all about data. Before that, I'd love if you'd fill out a form on whether you want to know more or respond to how this workshop was, what you enjoyed, what you didn't. It will just take about 5 minutes. If you just go to refound.com/pivotal. There is a short Google form with just about 4 or 5 questions for you. But as you're doing that, I'd love to hear some questions or comments that people have. Yeah.
So my question is more like, as I'm processing all this information, I found in those exercises that I could almost justify any of my things away. And I guess my question is that good? Is that like a good thing to be able to kind of like shove all those feelings off and like, is that coping or is that actually kind of dangerous? Because then what are you learning, I suppose? Does that question make any sense?
Tell me a little bit more about what feels dangerous to you.
I guess it's like if we can justify or validate any sort of like hard feelings that we've felt in the past based on interactions between coworkers, personal relationships, anything, then it almost seems like that would, in my mind, be dangerous, because then I'm not learning from those experiences and actually like taking that as like a token of, oh, in this experience, I had this feeling when this happened, and therefore like this is now in my treasure chest of things to be looking out for, in a way. It's almost like, I guess I'm having a hard time differentiating between a bias and a learning experience.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'm suggesting is that for us, all biases can be learning experiences. That the way that we react to information, it may or may not be correct. It could be correct. It doesn't mean that every time you feel that your colleague thinks that you're incompetent. They don't, unfortunately. There may be one or two times that they do. We're all guilty of that ourselves, right? But what this allows us to see is how often it happens that we think that they feel that way, which is very different from the frequency by which they actually feel that way, right? It may be that they're annoyed at us right now, but they're probably not annoyed with every single thing that we're doing that we think they are. So if we can step back and say, okay, what is the data that indicates that I'm right? What is the data that indicates that I'm wrong? And maybe it could be that I'm right. Maybe it is. But first you have to identify that outside of yourself as a bias, kind of make it something that you're subject to, make it object. Once you make it object and you see it outside of yourself, you can actually frame it, you can do something with it. And the step after that, which I didn't include here because of the nature of the presentation, but this is a workshop that we also give, which is on how do you then use this to bring it into different conversations with your colleagues. So if a step 4 would be curiosity. Ask. These are all hypotheses that we're running here in this context. We're doing it in a shortened form. But in your work, you have a lot more time, right? And once you have these different ways of looking at it, you can say, hey, just as I did at the Department of Justice with my supervisor, and I said, hey, you know, I just wanted to make sure, was it okay that I spoke? I wasn't sure about that. And I could get her feedback and hear that she said, oh, no, yeah, of course, that's fine. But we have to be able to identify the information first. So another hand.
Can you talk a little bit about that book? Is most of what you're presenting here sort of referenced in that book, or a couple of sentences about that so we know what it is?
Yeah. Yeah, so Good Authority, my partner and the founder of Refound, Jonathan Raymond, is a book that looks at reframing how we understand authority. That we operate positions of authority as if it's about giving the answers and always being right. We spend a lot of time protecting ourselves and trying to be the competent one and make sure that people do what we want them to do or understand what we're saying. Good Authority looks at reshaping what an authority means as really about leadership and working with teams to solve answers collectively. How can we change our own relationship with authority and our relationship with our colleagues to approach a different conversation? So the conversation about the step 4 of being curious, that's what Good Authority focuses on. Once we've done this background work to identify our conscious biases, because we're kind of upset and we want to talk to our partner about how they're always late, well, first I need to figure out, why is it that I think they're always late? Do I have a bias? Is it because of the first time they were late? Is it because their identity, I expected them to be late? Is it because I just really hate lateness and so I really noticed it? And then once we have that information, the part 2 is what this looks at, of how do we use that to be a good leader, to be a good teammate, because really everyone can be a leader at their level. Leadership is not about authority, it's about how we operate and how we create at whatever level we occupy. And this is how you can create that new conversation with your colleague. Anything else? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. And